Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be continuing our worst map ever series by looking at the map Mozdok. Now, much like Fulda and Sinai, we are going to take a brief look at the history of Mozdok because Mozdok has a rather interesting past. Mozdok is actually way bigger than most modern players will probably realize, and that is because a lot of the versions of Mozdok have actually been removed from the game entirely and are no longer in the matchmaker. This is actually the full version of Mozdok along with quite a few of the maps that were available in the past, and as you can see, the parts of Mozdok that were used were basically all over the place. There were a ton of different maps with a ton of different spawn points and capture points, and currently there is only one version of Mozdok still in the game. Around 90% of all variants of Mozdok have actually been removed at this point. Of course, when about 90% of all versions of a map have been removed, you know we're going to be in for a real winner. So kicking things off, one interesting aspect of Mozdok is not only is there only one permutation of the map, but there also aren't any other variants of that permutation. There is only a triple cap Mozdok in the matchmaker right now. No single caps, no double caps. So this will actually be a pretty easy video because I won't be discussing a bunch of different permutation and map sizes. Of course, starting as we usually do, we're going to go into the capture points, and this is where we're going to start seeing a lot of the problems. The A cap isn't that bad to get to, at least initially in the opening phases of the map, and it's not that bad to get off of. However, the A cap is so easily watched by positions up north and also down south that it is basically impossible to switch once you actually get going, because essentially you will always have players watching it. The southern capture point can basically watch it out of spawn, and the northern capture point just really has to take common positions that they always take up in order to watch the A cap. So the A cap ends up being very isolated very quickly and usually just gets taken at the very beginning of the game and doesn't get taken again until basically one team has already lost. That being said, the A cap does at least have a nice little depression and some fortifications that can make it a little bit harder for the enemy to take you out, but at the end of the day, it is still kind of a dead man's position. If you go there, you're probably not getting out anytime soon if you go there after about the 2-minute mark. The B cap is the central focus of Mozdok and has a few more avenues both into and out of it. The B cap in general, it's hard to tell from an overhead view, but is actually essentially a bowl, and at that bowl you have ridges on the outside, but there are also cutouts in the ridges that you can use to get onto the point. This makes the B cap actually reasonably accessible, but also makes it exposed from fire from a bunch of different sides, so you do have to be aware of those janky angles, especially the angles from the left and the far right. There are a series of one-story buildings on the B cap that you can use for some form of cover, but because of so many different angles coming into the B point, it can still be kind of difficult to keep yourself hidden. Additionally, one-story buildings are probably the worst kind of cover against aircraft because they're very easy to bounce a bomb off of and drop it right on top of your forehead. So on the whole, the B cap does have some cover, but it's not great. The best part about the B cap is that it's actually not that difficult to simply move off of the B cap because, again, you are in a bit of a bowl, so as long as you're not sitting in the middle trying to capture the point, you're usually fine. The C cap is very easily approached by the northern spawn and is very easily taken by the northern spawn, but is almost impossible to take from the southern spawn. The problem is that the C cap is basically visible from the northern spawn. It's kind of the same problem you have with the A cap, so if you do attempt to take it from the south, you're probably going to get plastered. That being said, the northern spawn does have pretty easy access to both get onto and off of it without really much trouble, so it does at least have that going for it that the A cap doesn't, but on the whole, both the C and A cap tend to stay in their respective teams' hands for basically the entire game, with B cap being the only one that's really contested. Moving on to movement lanes, and this is where I have to say is one of my least favorite parts of the map of Mozdok, and that is the general lack of movement lanes. There is a movement lane going up 2B and down 2B from the respective spawn points. However, the movement lanes around A and C both basically require you to take some fairly wide paths to avoid simply getting sniped, and even if you do so, you still have to be exposed at several points of the rotation. This actually facilitates a lot of camping around the A and C point rather than actually trying to move. You're better off trying to move around the B point, and even then you're still susceptible to getting sniped from positions around A and C. I will say anecdotally that the northern spawn has probably the best movement lanes on this map. The northern spawn has the easiest access to B under at least some form of cover, so if the enemy doesn't directly control B, you can get up to it pretty easily. Additionally, it's not that hard to get to C without getting shot at, and you can even get to positions in the north left-hand side of the map that can control the area around A without too much trouble. So overall, I do think the north spawn definitely has it better, even though the south spawn does have a few places it can go, especially in the bottom right-hand side of the map. Of course, this is where we discuss power positions, and this is where we're going to see our single biggest problem with Mozdok, and that is basically all of B is a giant power position. If your team controls B, because it is in a bowl and it has a bunch of cutouts that you can use to see out of it, you have a bunch of essentially horizontal and vertical cover available to you basically on demand. And it is also centrally located in the middle of the map, so you can shoot down at A, shoot down at C, shoot at other sniping points around A and C pretty easily, and more importantly, B can also spawn camp both spawns very efficiently. B is effectively the power position no matter how you slice it, and this is the single biggest issue with this map, is all that really matters is controlling B. That's not to say there aren't other good power positions, but it's important to qualify that as I go into some of these other power positions, remember that B controls the entire map. If you're not controlling B, the rest of these power positions are significantly less effective, and it is very uncommon to see a team win without controlling B. If I haven't emphasized this enough in this video, I need to emphasize it more. You need to control B. Going over to the left-hand side of the map first, and we have these positions immediately north of A that can be used to shoot onto the B point. They are pretty difficult to contest from the B point, but they're not impossible for B point just to simply close the line of sight, as there's only really one gap that you can see through in the bowl. Additionally, there is a point to the immediately northwest of B that can be used to cover basically the entire area around A. For this reason, the area around A ends up being basically a no man's land. Trying to occupy it without getting shot by somebody in one of these power positions, regardless of what team you're on, is often a bit suicidal, and this is compounded by the fact that you're basically right outside of the southern team's spawn, and they have a covered road that they can use to get shots on you pretty easily. So this is one of the areas of the map that ends up being mostly dead and very suicidal to move through. Additionally, C itself is tucked up nicely against the hill and has a fairly dominant position against basically the entire southern right-hand side of the map. It does have some capacity to shoot onto B, but in very limited. C is not as aggressive for it. However, there are positions down here in the bottom right-hand side of the map that you can get to pretty easily from the southern spawn that do have some shots into the cutouts around B and that can be used to do so. You can also use the river to push around the map and try to go for other positions, but this is pretty spotty, and if the enemy team catches you, you're often simply dead. Yet again, because you have the power positions on C itself, and you also have the southern spawn's power positions, the bottom right-hand side of the map, you end up in another complete dead zone where if you go there, it is very unlikely you come out alive unless the enemy team is basically already wiped out. Trying to push over this while the enemy team is still alive is likely going to result in you getting killed. And even if you push out a little bit and get to one of the rock formations or the covered river, it's very easily to end up trapped in a position where you basically don't have any way to push out. This also leads into another interesting observation, and that is Mozdok has some of the highest asymmetry in terms of air spawn out of basically any map. There are very few that do it this poorly. The northern spawn's helicopter spawn is behind the hill in the top left, so it actually has a lot of cover and can take very cheeky angles to try and get kills, which is very helpful. The southern spawn's helipad is all the way back on top of a hill and thus is actually visible to the northern spawn's anti-air basically the instant you spawn in. So it is usually a pretty questionable decision if you're in the southern spawn and you know the enemy has long range AA up to try and spawn a helicopter, because the likelihood of you getting plastered as soon as you take off the helipad is pretty high. Additionally, because the northern spawn does have the hill protecting the helicopters, this can also protect approaches by their planes, whereas the southern spawn has a nice big flat plane right behind it that is very easy to spot any approaching aircraft. So the northern spawn also has the advantage in terms terms of fixed-wing aviation as well. Overall, the northern spawn just has a lot of cards that they can play in terms of the aircraft, and the southern spawn has very little it can do to counter it. Technically speaking, if the northern spawn does try to take one of their planes out to go after a southern spawn helipad, the southern spawn has very clear visibility to it, but this will be of little consequence, as most of the time the big threat to your helicopters are the long-range AA on the ground and not actually enemy planes. So as far as tips and tricks and how Mozdok currently plays, you're probably expecting me to tell you with all of the advantages the northern spawn has, both in terms of movement lanes and air spawns, that the northern spawn is the best, and it is. But this is one of those rare instances of what I call idiot balance. That is to say, one colossal mistake in balance is made up for by another colossal mistake in balance. It turns out while the north spawn does have a lot of advantages, the B point is so powerful that all of those advantages get quickly negated as soon as you control it. The advantages that the northern spawn has around C, even around the top left-hand corner of the map, all get negated once the bottom spawn captures B, and if the bottom spawn captures B, it also negates the northern spawn's advantage in being able to move towards B because you have excellent visibility over that part of the map. So on the whole, as long as you capture B, the asymmetries between the spawns don't really matter that much. That being said, the asymmetries are pretty pronounced, and I suspect that's part of the reason why Mozdok has never been seriously considered as an esports map, but that's another discussion entirely. Ultimately, the strategy of Mozdok is really just control B. There are some areas around A, specifically north of it, and south of C that you can use as sniping positions if you do have long-range vehicles. However, this is mostly just supporting fire, and whoever wins on B is probably going to take the map. It is just such a dominant position and has such a power position over both spawns that it's kind of hard to do anything once the enemy team has a hold of it. This is also one of those interesting elements where controlling the area around A is vitally important to the southern spawn, but the northern spawn could care less about it. The area doesn't have anywhere near as good visibility onto the northern spawn as it does onto the southern spawn, so the area immediately north of A is vital for the southern spawn to have at least some presence on, but the northern spawn can just ignore it and go straight towards B. That being said, the biggest challenge and the biggest thing that you have to be aware of when you're going on B is all of the little cutouts in the bowl around B that allow enemies to shoot you from long range from various positions around the map. That is always the biggest threat to you while you're on B. Ironically, other players on B aren't as big of a threat because they likely have the same concerns that you do. If they just drive around and ignore all of the cutouts in the sides of the bowl around B, they'll probably get sniped as well. So that is always your first consideration when fighting around B, is keeping aware of all of those sight lines coming from the far left, the far right, the south, the north, etc. that can potentially snipe you while you're trying to fight someone else, and then you worry about trying to fight the other person on the point. Of course, once you have secured the point and you're no longer in a position where you have to be around the middle of B, then you're basically free to just farm the enemy. You can go to whatever part of the bowl you want to that is near where you suspect enemies are. You can peek, you can use the elevated position and the third-person camera to see over the hill, and you can simply poke out and fire whenever the opportunity arises. The enemy can't really do much to you unless they outnumber you pretty significantly or have some really accurate air support to accompany them. On the whole, I would generally say that if one team wants to hold B, the other team has to be very coordinated to take it back from them, and that ultimately means that your objective is to never have to retake B. Make sure you have it firmly in your possession from the word go. As for my thoughts on Mozdok, Mozdok is one of those maps that I consider banning the most. It's the map I like the least because even when I have good games on it, it's undeniable that it is a very monotonous playstyle. There's only a handful of positions that can really allow you to win the game, and there's a few others that you can use to snipe from, but ultimately are a lot less important. It really is one of those maps where there's a very singular strategy, and if you adhere to that strategy and you can do it successfully, you will always win, and that's not exactly the most exciting gameplay. On top of that, Mozdok, because the emphasis is basically on B and B has a dominant spawn camping position, it's basically spawn camping the map, but that's really all you do. And a lot of times, especially if you're in the southern spawn, sites around C, sites around north of A and B are all shooting down on you, and there's basically nowhere to go. You're just stuck in your spawn sitting behind the one raised road, and you really have no options. That being said, the northern spawn often doesn't end up in that much better of a position if the southern spawn can take both the area north of A, B, and C, because at that point you might as well just throw in the towel from the northern spawn as well. It's not like either spawn reacts very well to it. So yet again, because it is kind of spawn camping the map and also has a singular power position that just dominates everything, I find it to be at best a very boring map to play, and at worst a very repetitive one. And I will remind everybody watching this that this is the best version of Mozdok. This is the one they kept. And if you have never played the other versions of Mozdok, they were right to keep it if they were going to keep any of them, because the others were somehow worse. Mozdok has been in War Thunder since 2014, so over 10 years, and there's basically never been a single point where if you said, "I hate Mozdok," you wouldn't get a firm agreement from much of the community. This map is widely disliked, and for good reason. Of course, those are just my thoughts on the matter. What do you think of Mozdok? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Let me know in the comments down below. I always love to hear from you guys. If you liked the video, found it entertaining, educational, a like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte tschüss.